welcome everybody to this NCPA briefing on unemployment. We are struggling with this chronic unemployment problem, hovering just right around 8%, a little more than 8%. And so we thought we'd assemble a panel of experts to throw out a few ideas on how to tackle this 8% unemployment problem and break that and really see if we can put some solutions on the table, private sector solutions that will help solve that unemployment problem. So I present our panel this morning. We'll start off by hearing a few brief remarks from Bob Snelling. Mr. Snelling heads up a group called Ross HR, which is a private employment firm. He's also the founder of Snelling & Snelling, which is a worldwide employment firm that he started and still holds his name. And we decided last night that the Snelling name is a brand in and of itself, and so we'll be pleased to hear from him a little bit about his experience and a few remarks. We'll then move on to Bill Connerly, who holds a PhD, received a PhD in economics from Duke University. He lives out in Lake Oswego, Oregon, which I met Bill for the first time last night, and after just even a couple of minutes made me want to move back out west and live in Oregon, but described what it's like out there. He is part of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors and is chairman of the board of directors at the Cascade Policy Institute, and is also a senior fellow at National Center for Policy Analysis. We'll then hear from Pam Villarreal. She's also a senior fellow at National Center for Policy Analysis and is our expert on retirement, Social Security, economic growth, and tax issues. She's written many studies and analyses on a lot of the issues that she's going to talk about today on employment, as well as other issues, tax, Social Security, retirement, 401ks. She's written some of the premier pieces out there on the dangers of borrowing from your 401k and some other interesting things, and you're welcome to check out our website on the things that she's written. And then we'll conclude the panel by hearing from David Ranson, who's the president and director of research over at Wainwright Economics. He's been a general partner at Wainwright since 1977. Prior to that, he taught economics at the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business, and he's been an assistant to Treasury Secretary William E. Simon, and he was a member of George Shultz's staff over at OMB. So after Mr. Ranson is finished speaking, we'll open it up for any questions and answers that you might have, and so we'll just proceed in that order. Mr. Snelling.
Thank you, Brian. I'm glad he didn't say how long I was with Snelling & Snelling. Then we start adding it up. You know, looking for work is frustrating, tedious, hard work. It's discouraging. And most people don't have the foggiest idea how to do it. They don't know how to write a resume. They don't know how to be interviewed. They don't know how to work their network. They don't know how to find the companies that are looking for people like them. So an answer to the unemployment situation is a no-brainer. It really is, because I'm here to tell you that right now, today, throughout the United States, there are over 20 million jobs available on all levels, from trainees all the way up to CEOs and CFOs and VPs and so on. And that number, I'm being very judicious in giving you that number, because if I said it was higher, you would not believe me. So I'm going to go with 20 million because I'm assured of that, that figure is correct. The proposal that we're recommending that the governments consider, not just federal but state, is that the private sector, you know, the government uses private sector for everything, from butter to battleships and accountants to architects and, computer people and consultants. They use you consultants all the time. I mean, so they hire the private sector all the time. So why not hire the private sector employment services? There's over 15,000 offices they have throughout the United States. And they employ close to 100,000 people who know how to do the things I talked about. Write resumes, teach someone how to be interviewed, get them the interview with the company, coach them on it. They're experienced. This is how they make their living. They wouldn't be in business if they didn't know how to do this. And they know where those 20 million jobs are and how to get to them. So we're saying hire them because it's a no-brainer. It doesn't cost anything. If the private sector places an unemployed person, they immediately go off unemployment compensation. And sometimes they're also getting welfare and food stamps and I don't know what all. So they're getting other things as well. And you save 99 weeks of unemployment compensation. That's a lot of money for the small amount, literally the small amount that a private service, employment service, would charge the government. So the government starts to make money the minute this happens. And this is not pie in the sky. This has been done. We did it. We did it in Pennsylvania years ago. We got the state legislature to say that people who were unemployed, in addition to having to go out and knock on doors and look for jobs, also would have to go to the private sector employment services, and which they did. And we were able to place them by the thousands. And we not only got them a job, at McDonald's flipping hamburgers, we got them jobs that were better than the one that they had been laid off from. We got them better jobs because we knew what their value that they had. We could sell companies on hiring them and giving them a better job and giving them an opportunity, switching fields. People switch fields all the time, from accounting to sales and from sales to management. So we helped them do that. And the interesting thing was that for every person that we placed, we took 2 more off the rolls. We got both the unemployment compensation people, but we also got the people, the able to work welfare people. And we took them off the rolls because they didn't want a job. They had a job, some of them. Others were painting houses or driving a hack in a cab, and this was additional money they were getting, the unemployment. Of course, when the unemployment runs out, those that want to work, they go to work right away. It's not a problem. My prime example of this is my own daughter. I'm ashamed to have to tell you. She's a CPA, straight 4.0, college grad, and after raising her children, when she went back to work right away. Got a job paying, $58,000 a year. And then after a year or so, she lost that because the real estate firm she was with was on hard times. And so she went and collected unemployment. I went out of my mind. I said, Lee, you can go to work tomorrow. I said, I know 10 companies that will hire you and pay you between $50,000 to $60,000 a year. I said, you're settling for 20. It was $400 a week she was getting, $20,000 a year. But her husband was making good money, paying all the bills, and she just took a vacation for a year. And when her unemployment ran out, she went to work, boom, the next, within a week. It's just, it's done every day out there. It's being done. There's newspaper articles about it. I have one in here. I was up in Tennessee, and the companies up there were complaining that their unemployment compensation tax, the UC tax, was high to pay for these people when, they knew they had jobs. They had jobs for people, and they couldn't get the people to come and go to work for them. So the thing is that, as I said, it's a no-brainer. It could be put in immediately, and with all of these jobs out there, people could be put back to work. When they earn more money than, like my daughter at $400 a week, and now instead of $20,000, now she's making almost $60,000. She has extra money to spend. Also, she pays more taxes into the government. So, it's a win-win situation to use the private sector employment services to put these people back to work, because it's a guaranteed thing. You put someone to work, the private sector does, and let's say they only work 10 days, and for some reason the company doesn't like them, or they quit the job, the state would get back, or the government would get back 90% of what they paid. It's 1% a day for 100 days. It was the guarantee we had for years and years and years. It's industry-wide. So the state would get their money back, put the person back on the unemployment roll, have them go back, and maybe another employment service would get them and put them to work, hopefully, to get them a job that they could last on. So it's guaranteed all around, and it's good business. It's good for America. And we need to have some people thinking about it and putting it to work. It's real easy to do because they're there and they're ready to go.
Thank you very much, Bob. He said into the microphone. My wife is an eye surgeon, and when she comes home at the end of the day and says that she had an interesting day, I know that somebody's vision or maybe life was at risk. When I come home and say, as an economist, I've had an interesting day, somebody's job was at risk, somebody's home was at risk, somebody's livelihood was at risk. This is a very serious issue, and what I am here to do is to put some hard numbers and academic research behind Bob's insights from his experience and judgment. When we set up the unemployment insurance system back in the 1930s, we had 4 goals for it. One is eliminating poverty. Obviously, that hasn't worked. To prevent layoffs. Obviously, that hasn't worked. To eliminate the social stigma associated with being unemployed. Although we now know that people who are long-term unemployed are looked down upon as job applicants. And fourthly, to maintain purchasing power so that we would have a stable economy. This economy does not feel particularly stable to me. And I believe that a great deal of the problem is weak job search. The system of unemployment insurance has some disincentives, and we have a lot of academic evidence cited in my paper on the disincentives to find jobs. And it's not a case where people are saying, I'm going to turn down a job offer because unemployment insurance pays me. Typically, it's a little less than half of the previous wage. What happens is the people are not getting the job offers. At one time, unemployment was about somebody at a factory being told, we're shutting down for 3 weeks, we'll call you when we come back up. And the person who's unemployed just sits at home waiting for the call. Today, most of the layoffs are permanent layoffs. And the phone is never going to ring unless the unemployed person gets out there. But I've been unemployed, I've collected unemployment insurance, and everything Bob said is accurate. It is frustrating, it's embarrassing, it's uncomfortable, it's a task that most people aren't familiar with. And what do human beings do when faced with a task that is embarrassing, uncomfortable, unfamiliar? I postpone it as long as I can. And so one of the interesting academic studies looked at the percentage of unemployed people who find a job in any given week. And if you go from like the 5th week of unemployment through the 10th week through the 15th week, the percentage of people who find jobs go down and down and down, and then it spikes up in the last week of eligibility for unemployment insurance. People say, oh, holy cow, I'm told this cow, oh, holy cow, I need to find a job. And as a result, if we could nudge the job search efforts a little bit, we could get faster employment. Now, the government statistics that you'll be hearing about from David in a moment are looking typically at net job creation, and we'll see a headline in the paper saying it was 150,000 jobs or 200,000 jobs created. That's a net number. There are people losing jobs or quitting jobs or dying on the job, and there are people being hired. And last month, there were about 3.3 million people hired. And there are a number of job openings. The official BLS statistics are a little lower than Bob's estimates, but they don't count many openings that don't quite fit their definition. If we got people working harder at finding a job, we can fill jobs faster. We will have employers hiring people for whom they don't have an opening. I've done it myself with my small business. The right resume came in, and I said, oh, I'm going to hire this person, even though I had not had an opening. I was not advertising. And I've seen it happen at very large corporations where I've worked. So we can get more activity going on, but the real challenge we have today is that the average unemployed person is spending 41 minutes a day looking for work. So you lose your 8-hour-a-day job, and you replace that with 41 minutes. This, again, Bureau of Labor Statistics figures, 41 minutes of job search. What really goes up for unemployed people is watching television. So the staffing companies can play a vital role, but before I move into staffing companies, let me mention a couple of experiments that have been run. Arizona's Employment Security Department did an interesting little experiment a few years back where they said, everybody who's been unemployed 6 weeks, come in, we're going to have a little meeting with you and review your obligations as an unemployment insurance recipient and make sure you have to do job search. And they found that those meetings were hugely successful in getting people to find work. So much so that the benefits saved were 15 times greater than the cost of having face-to-face interviews. You don't see very many things with 15-to-1 benefit cost ratios going on. That experiment was discontinued, and I can explain why. I'll explain why in a moment. In another case, a consortium of nonprofits hired somebody to provide job search assistance to the laid off people from the employers in this consortium, and that was a call that just said, hey, we want to help. What do you need help with? Do you need help with a resume? Do you need help with ideas on who's hiring? And that consortium estimated that they saved $2 in benefit for every $1 in expense. So these face-to-face or telephone-to-telephone, but a personalized meeting is an approach that helps people. But our current unemployment insurance system is based on automated systems, and they're much more efficient for an unemployed person. In 1996, I lost a job through a corporate restructuring, and I would keep up to date with the employment department by picking up the phone, press 1 if you've looked for a job. The only human contact I had was listening to a recorded voice. And now, of course, we've gone internet, and there isn't a lot more human contact. So we need to get some human contact in there, and that's where the staffing industry is well set up. They are used to face-to-face. They're employing something like 13 million people in any year go through staffing companies to find work. They can speed the job search effort. And this speed is really important. We know that the longer a person spends unemployed, the lower the odds are that that person will find a job. And we also know that job skills tend to deteriorate. People lose the ability to read and comprehend difficult instruction manuals when they are removed from that environment. So getting people reemployed faster is important. We have large potential gains to the unemployment insurance system by getting people reemployed faster. Those gains can be shared with staffing companies. Staffing companies are for-profit businesses. They need to be paid somehow in order to get them actively helping a group of people. They're not currently acting. And there are several models. One is there could be a staffing company that wins a bid in each metropolitan area. There are so many different kinds of staffing companies, though. Some of them specialize in nursing. Some of them specialize in industrial jobs. Some of them IT, that if you went to one company in a metropolitan area, it would probably want to subcontract with others, and that would be easy to set up. Another potential model is competing staffing companies where you say, hey, we'll give you a bonus if you can get people back to work, and let the staffing companies compete with each other to provide services to the unemployed. And thirdly, another approach might be to let companies self-insure their unemployment insurance. Right now, companies pay into an unemployment insurance fund, and it's sort of based upon the company's experience rating, how many layoffs have been charged to them, but the system works very imperfectly. There are floors, and if you're at the minimum, then an extra layoff doesn't affect you. There are ceilings, and if you're at the highest tax rate, layoffs don't help. And even if you're in the middle, in some states, like in my state of Oregon, an extra $100 worth of unemployment insurance benefits only costs the company itself $20. So there isn't that one-to-one connection you would get if you let them self-insure. And in that environment, I think you'd see a lot of companies saying, gee, we can save money by helping direct our laid-off employees to a staffing company that can work with them. Now, there are definitely going to be some challenges working with them. One of them is what I call the two-bucket problem. Think back to that Arizona study I mentioned where they were providing services. They were getting huge benefits, $15 worth of benefits for every dollar worth of administrative expenses. I asked the person who had run the program, why did you stop doing it? And he says, well, we have one bucket for paying claims to the unemployed. We have another bucket for administration, and we can't mix the two. So they had huge savings in one bucket, but they couldn't spend from the other bucket because they were out of money. The solution to that is called a diversion tax, and we've done it in my state of Oregon to help subsidize jobs at times. And the way a diversion tax works is you take the official tax and you cut it by, say, 1 percentage point, and at the same time you implement a new tax of same amount, 1 percentage point, and that new tax puts money into a pool to be used to help get rapid reemployment of the unemployed through staffing companies. The second challenge is going to be cream skimming. If I were running a staffing company, I would really want to serve all those people who have computer science degrees and 3 years of experience, or RNs with a couple of years of experience. Those are easy to place. The dropout who's been working in a factory in a declining industry, going to be a bigger challenge. We can handle that, and there have actually been statistical models developed saying, given these characteristics, education, industry, age, this person has an easy time or a hard time getting reemployed, and we can compensate the staffing company on that basis. So they get paid just a little bit for the easy to place person, but get paid a lot for the more difficult to place person. So there will be challenges to work through, but we can deal with them. I think the most important thing is we have a system that is not meeting its initial goals, and as a result, we have many long-term unemployed who are getting discouraged, and all the talk about there are no jobs available further discourages them. If we move them into talking to the people in the staffing agencies, I think we'll find a sense of optimism, we'll find faster reemployment, and that will become stimulative to the overall economy as the people who are reemployed faster start spending money at their neighborhood stores. Thank you.
I'm Pam Villarreal at the NCPA, and I'm going to be addressing a few points from the supply side and the demand side for labor. So first of all, why aren't companies hiring? The one thing we need to do, the first thing, is to reduce the cost of hiring. Let me give you an example. I have a publication in your packet on the minimum wage. The minimum wage is, the standard federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. In many states it's more, and in San Francisco it's the highest at about $10.24 an hour. The unemployment rate among teenagers is the highest of all age groups. It's about 25% for 16 to 19-year-olds. Here in DC, it's 51%. It's higher than any other age group. And obviously, a company is not going to employ somebody for $7.25 an hour or $10.24 an hour if their production isn't equivalent to that value. So there's a discouragement from hiring people who have very few skills, who are entry level, who just want to get their foot in the job market because companies are being forced to pay these mandated wages. And, many make the argument that, well, we need minimum wage because we have all these families that need to be supported, but very few people earning minimum wage support a family. Most of them are part-time workers, most of them are second earners, and most of them are teenagers or young people who live with their parents. So that's a myth that somehow we need to raise this minimum wage so that everybody can start supporting their families and making ends meet. And I might add that that wage is actually often passed on in the price of goods and services. Here's an example. You've probably seen the ads for Subway sandwiches. They offer these $5 foot-long specials. Well, these Subways in San Francisco can't do that anymore because they're paying their Subway sandwich artists $10.24 an hour. And maybe they're worth $10.24 an hour. Maybe they're very great sandwich artists. But they can't offer this $5 footlong anymore. So it's obvious that somebody is having to absorb the cost of these high wages, and it's usually the consumer. Now here's the deal. Mandated wages will probably never go away. But we are proposing that people age 16 to 17 be exempt from the minimum wage. With so many teenagers looking for jobs, I think at this point many teenagers will be willing to work for less than $7.25 an hour just to get the experience. And I think at that age, that's mostly what teenagers want, is experience. They want a chance to get their foot in the door. They want a chance to be in a workplace environment and see what it is they want to do when they go to college. So they don't have to go into college and change their major 5 times and spend extra money on college. I might add that President Obama enacted a program called We Can't Wait to address the teenage unemployment problem. His goal was to employ 250,000 people at a cost of $1.5 billion. Now, when you go on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, you will see that there are these positions open. Most of them are internships. But I guarantee you that the private sector could employ 250,000 teenagers for a third of that cost. Most of that money is going to go to bureaucrats, to administrative costs, to keeping track of who is hired and when and how the program is going. And I guarantee you we'll never really know how the program worked. So we don't really need We Can't Wait. What we need is to lift some of the restrictions on companies that have to pay these wages so that we can start employing teenagers and expose them to the workforce. Another thing that is keeping companies from hiring, and this may change on Thursday, I don't know for sure, is the Affordable Care Act. Companies are required to provide health insurance for their employees. The problem is if you're a small business with 25 people or less, you get this tax credit. But as you get a tax credit for providing insurance, it starts to go away. So the more people you have working for you and the more of the higher average salary they have, the more this tax credit is reduced. And by the time you have 50 employees, you're forced to pay, to provide health insurance for them or to pay a fine. So what this does, this is the most perverse incentive for growing a company. It really keeps companies from wanting to hire because they want to stay under that limit where they're going to get this full tax credit. So there's no incentive for them to grow, to add employees to their companies. There's no incentive for them to actually raise the wages because you have to have an average wage of $25,000. So if you bring somebody into your company that is being paid more and brings up the average, then you start losing this tax credit. It's a very perverse incentive. So the cost of actually hiring that extra worker is hugely expensive, more than the employee's salary. Another thing we need to do is to create more certainty in the economy. As you're aware, the R&D tax credit this year is nowhere to be found. It has been renewed 13 times since the 80s. This year it has not been renewed. Now, many people tend to downplay it. They say, well, companies don't need this and it's just corporate welfare. But really, the R&D tax credit is very important. And it's not so much the credit itself, it's the certainty of it being there. When companies plan ahead and decide how many they're going to hire or what kind of money they're going to put into research and development, they don't just plan for the next year. They don't wait till the tax cuts are are renewed when the ball is dropping on New Year's Eve, which is usually when we find out that they're being renewed. And then they decide, okay, I'm going to plan for the next year. They usually have 5-year plans. Right now, the credit is, in case you're not familiar with it, it actually helps firms offset the cost of developing new products, or they may improve on an existing product. This is especially important for companies that have very, very high development costs like pharmaceuticals. These costs that are eligible for the credit include wages, patent fees, attorney fees. So yes, if you hire people that are in the process of developing, then these companies get a credit for the wages of that person. And they can claim a 14% credit for their expenses that are in excess of half of the R&D expenditures. But right now, many other countries, of course, have caught on to this, and we now have a effective tax credit that is 18th in the developed world. We rank 18th in providing a tax credit. China, India, and Brazil now provide a higher tax credit than we do. So it's no wonder that development and manufacturing is moving overseas. You can't blame U.S. companies when it's to their cost advantage to do that. So our solution would be to at least raise the rate to 20%. Many businesses at the current 14% have recommended it be 20%, and at least extend it for 5 years. And I might add, even Obama proposed it in his 2013 budget, and it would cost about 1/5 of other programs, such as extending unemployment benefits. So this is definitely a bipartisan solution. Finally, another way to get rid of the uncertainty in the economy is to extend the Bush tax cuts. As I said, by the time we find out they've been extended, we'll be watching the ball drop at Times Square. And that is no way for people to plan how they're going to budget, but also it affects small businesses, and I'll tell you why. 93% of small businesses actually pay for their earnings through their 1040. It's called pass-through income. So they're not paying this big corporate tax rate, but they are paying, they are paying the marginal income tax rates. So small businesses, your dry cleaner, your nail technician, and my nail technician gives me all kinds of stories about her tax system. They definitely need to know whether their tax cuts are going to be expired. They can't just keep waiting year to year because they also plan. They don't plan just for the next month or the next 6 months. They need to plan as well. Another point I'd like to make is we need to create more incentives for investment in workers. Right now, since Japan lowered their tax rate, we have the highest tax rate, corporate tax rate in the developed world at 35%. The percentage of tax revenue from companies as a percent of GDP has been falling. It's now about 1.3% of GDP as far as tax revenue. Back in the 50s, it was 5.6%. It might seem very popular to kind of stick it to companies and make them pay a 35% rate because they don't pay enough taxes. But the problem is in this global economy, many countries are lowering their corporate tax rates. We have to compete. So we think the tax rate should come down to at least 25%, but even a better solution would be to impose a territorial tax system, where if you have a U.S. company that has has a majority of their business over in another country, they pay that country's tax rate, and they can repatriate their profits back here and invest them without paying our tax rate as well. I once talked to a gentleman from Ireland. They have a 12.5% corporate tax rate. And he said, oh, we just thank the United States because they brought so much business over here because of their very low tax rate. So we need to get serious about doing that and not just assuming that these companies are not affected by those. And finally, my last thing I'd like to say is I'm looking at the supply of labor, and I have a piece in there in your packet on disability. We're letting today's discouraged workers fall off a cliff. More people, in the past 3 years, about 5 million people have filed for disability benefits. Right now, about 1.5 million of those people have been approved. You know, many people say, well, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we should have more employed, disabled. We have the supposed disability rate is declining, but actually the disability rate is declining for people over the age of 65. For people under 65, the disability rate is actually climbing. So now nearly 11 million people receive disability benefits. So when you get a bad economy, you have people go and file for disability. They usually bring a lawyer the first time. They get the benefits. The Social Security Administration says that about 0.5% of those people will ever go back to work. Now, I've read a couple private studies that say that less than 3% will go back to work, so that's an improvement. But either way, what you do is you end up getting people on here on the disability rolls that are struggling through a bad economy. It's easy to get on the roll, and then they never go back to work, and we lose them for good. The workforce is shrinking. As a matter of fact, back in 1980, 3% of the working age population was on disability. Now it's 5%. 1 in 20 people of working age are on disability, and by about 2020, that'll be 1 in 14. So we need to change the disability system as part of an overall entitlement reform plan. NCPA proposes making the disability system into a privately pre-funded system where you can get disability insurance through the private sector. They tend to actually help with vocational training. There are many people, let me just throw out this, I'm running out of time, but let me throw out this one statistic. About half of people on disability under the age of 50 now are on there for mental disorders. Okay, we think of mental disorders as mental retardation, schizophrenia, whatever, but half of those people on mental disorders are suffering from depression or anxiety. Those are the two easiest treated mental disorders, and people tend to get better over time, but these people will be on disability probably for the rest of their lives. So we need to pay attention to who's on disability. We need to try to get them actively back in the workforce, and we need to create a system where there's not these perverse incentives for them to stay on it. And there's more information on this in the packet. Thank you very much.
Well, you've heard a lot of the human side, the micro side of employment and unemployment from my fellow speakers, and I certainly agree with nearly all of what they've said. And of course, when I hear more and more about the facts, they're terrible facts, get more and more depressed. I'm here to represent the inhuman side, the statistical side. And you'll find in your packet, and you may find it useful to use this, it should look like this. These are my illustrations of some of the factual material I want to run through, statistical material. Basically, I'm looking for something that's simple and transparent. We live in a world of spin, and my job is to marshal the data, to look at the evidence, and then that leads, of course, to analyzing the evidence, but I'll mostly look at the evidence itself in the few minutes that I've got. But I want to do it in a very transparent and simple way, and the funny thing is, the more transparent and the more simple you make it, the more unfamiliar the facts become, because we live in a world of spin. What we think is true is often directed by the spin and not by the simplest representation of the facts. So there may be some facts in here that I'm going to be showing you that surprise you, and I hope I imagine they will. But we'll start with very familiar facts. On the first page, I've just got a list of unemployment rates. There isn't one. We talk about 8.2% unemployment, but of course there are many different unemployment rates. First of all, you can define unemployment in a lot of different ways. You can include the discouraged workers, or you can exclude them. You can include people who are looking for work or not, as the case may be. There are many definitions, and the highest one that the government publishes is 15%. But even among these different definitions, if you just pick one definition, as the government does, one that only gives us a rate of 8%, 8.2, there are still many different unemployment rates because there are many different segments of society, and we've heard a lot about the teenagers with one of the highest rates, but we've got Asians at 5.2, whites at 7.4, Hispanics at 11.0, and blacks at 13.6. So you can get very much higher rates. The problem is a lot bigger than it looks. If the figure of 8.2 were right, it would imply something manageable. But when we see some of the much higher figures, when we think about it and look at different parts of society, it's a much less manageable problem. It all has to do, of course, with the progress that we're making in the current recovery. And in my next page, I'm looking at previous recoveries in the post-war period. We've had about 8 or 9 recessions. Each one of them has been followed by a recovery. On the average, or taking the median, it takes 5 quarters to get from the peak level of GDP before the turn down back up to that same level again after the climb back. 5 quarters. This time, starting with the peak back in the end of 2007, it's taken 15 quarters. So we're recovering at 1/3 the average rate of the post-war period. Most people are aware of that to some extent, but it's pretty stark when you measure it that way. Another way to measure it is to look at broad-based, but widely watched indicators of the economy. And I have a graph that looks like this. It's a plot of the employment, but it also compares it with retail sales, adjusted for inflation, and industrial production. And the graph shows that none of these 3 indicators are back yet, even now, to the level that they had before the big recession hit. So GDP, if anything, is overstating how well we're doing. Another alarming figure is, of course, as a result of what the government is doing to speed up the recovery, to spend more, we're getting into more debt. And another very alarming picture is this one, which shows the debt growing. This is the debt held by the public. It doesn't include debt that cancels out because the government itself owns some of its own debt. Here's the debt held by the public growing, and there's the GDP growing. And here another very simple fact is that the debt's growing 3 times faster. Even now, even after all the recovery, 3 years of recovery, the debt is still growing 3 times faster than the economy is. Now, in the next page, it gets more statistical. We can ask, is this debt doing anything for us? We've had deficits in the past as well. We've got a long history of deficits in the US, most other countries too. And we can figure out whether deficits led to stimulus, as is often claimed, and to higher economic growth, or something else. Well, going back to 1810, believe it or not, we can split the history into decades, which is 200 years, 20 decades, and we find systematically the decades in which the debt grew the most relative to the economy were the growth rates of the economy that were the lowest. And when the debt failed to grow relative to the economy, those were the growth rates, those were the decades in which the economy grew the best. Now, part of the reason for that, admittedly, is that when the economy fails to grow, it doesn't produce as much tax revenue. So the deficit is an ambiguous figure. We certainly should worry about deficits, but a wide deficit can mean insufficient tax, or it can mean excessive spending. Which is it? Well, we can solve that problem by just focusing on the spending. We can go through the same exercise, divide US history into all the possible decades, and figure out in which decades did the government increase its spending the most, and in which decades did it reduce its spending the most, and how does that correlate with how the economy performed. And what we find, this is page 6 now, the decades in which spending grew the most were the lowest growth decades, and the decades in which federal spending grew the least were the highest growth decades. Well, what is the reason for this? It's been known for a long time, but you don't hear about it often enough, and it's called crowding out. And you'll see another graph. This is in the form of a bar chart, but this is really showing you an inverse relationship between the growth of federal government spending in general, it may include the states and localities in this particular case, and the growth of the private side of the economy. Notice the thing is that the bar on the left, which shows the lowest private growth, that is the biggest decline in the private economy, that corresponds to the largest increase in government spending, and vice versa. A very strong inverse relationship. It's called crowding out. If you study it in great detail, you find that for every dollar that the government spends, the private sector spends at least $1 less. And it applies to employment as well. I only had these numbers relatively recently. There's so many numbers to go through, you're always coming up with surprises. You never know what the results are going to be, and I was surprised by this one. But let's suppose the government goes out and hires people, and I've got figures for government employment. If government employment grows in a particular year, one would expect that the total employment for the whole economy should grow as well. And it does temporarily. But you wait a year, and especially after you've waited 2 years, you find that the years in which the government added to its payrolls the most, 2 years later, were the years in which the total economy lost jobs relative to the alternative, where the government was adding to its payrolls the least. Again, it's crowding out. When the government adds people to its payrolls, people are dropped from the payrolls of the private sector. Well, it all ties in with this. The reason we get crowding out is a very basic piece of economics. And again, it's not one you hear very much, particularly not in Washington. But it's the idea of the economy as a circular system. This is a fourfold symmetry. You can measure the economy by its output. You can measure it by its input, which includes employment, of course, input of labor, but also input of other resources. You can measure the economy by its income. You can measure the economy by its spending. And if you look for the statistics on all these 4 different measures of the economy, they're all somewhat different. But if you look at them more closely, allowing for statistical discrepancies among them, they all tend to grow at the same rate. And the reason is that the economy is a single system, it's a circular system, everything is tied to everything else. You can't add to the system, you can't subtract from the system. The best you can do is encourage it to work more efficiently. That you can do. But you can't just say, we'll have more jobs. By having a piece of the system, add the jobs, because the jobs will be taken away from somewhere else in the system. It's a perfect example of a system that you would find in sciences like physics, chemistry, biology, medicine, astronomy, you name it. They're all systems, and in none of them do we ever imagine that there's some central government running the whole show, unless you're extremely religious, perhaps. Only in economics do we imagine that there's somebody in the middle, right here actually, running the whole show. But I'm arguing it's really no different from physics, chemistry, astronomy, and all the rest. But although I've shown, I think, these basic facts that government spending does not stimulate, it isn't the major factor. And taxes are not the major factor either. The major factor is something you wouldn't have expected. But one of the stimulus policies that the US government has been following for a long time, under Republicans as well as Democrats, is the cheap dollar policy. I used to work at the Treasury, so I know an awful lot about the cheap dollar policy. Well, what happens when you get a cheap dollar? How do you measure a cheap dollar? I don't think we should measure the dollar against the euro and say that if the dollar declines or rises against the euro, that's in some way cheapening or increasing in value. We've got to measure it against something serious like gold. And on this page, it's the number 10 in my handout. What you find is that the years in which the dollar cheapened the most are the years in which output grew the least, not only in the same year, but in the following year, the year after that, and the year after that. And it accumulates to a very large amount of lost output. So it actually dominates the spending data, bad as they are, and the deficit data, and even the tax data. The biggest single factor in government policy, hardly ever discussed really in this context, is the depreciation of the currency. And you'll see there are 2 graphs here. Just the other day, I thought, let me add something to this. Let me look at the employment record. So instead of looking merely at GDP, which we always start with, I looked to see whether a depreciating dollar leads to faster growing employment. And of course, I got the same result as I got with GDP. The faster the dollar depreciates, the more the price of gold goes up, measured in dollars, the lower the growth rate of employment. So we have a lot of government policies here that are already at work. In my last page, I'm showing the distinction between stimulus and restraint. And I'm arguing that the declining dollar is not stimulative, it is a restraining force. Increased federal spending is not stimulative, it's a restraining force. And we have also the distinction between true stimulus and false stimulus. We wouldn't be in such bad shape if we were aware which is which, stimulus versus restraint. But if we're unaware and we think we're doing something that's supposed to be stimulating and actually it's restraining, and we aren't aware of it, or we don't even look in that direction to find out whether it's true or not, then we're really in bad shape. And that, I think, is the shape that we're in. So I'll cut it down to 10 minutes. So more time for questions.
Great, thank you very much. This has been a great panel. Let me kick off the questions just very quickly, and then we'll open it up if you all have any questions. I was intrigued. We're in 15 quarters, you said, of recovery, which is unusually long. And Pam, you talked about how there's the uncertainty with tax policy. You talked about R&D tax policy. It occurs to me we have an uncertain healthcare policy, uncertain energy policy. It's very difficult for a business, it seems to me, to even predict next year or 2 or 3, let alone 5 years down the road, what their healthcare costs are going to be, because nobody's quite certain what our national healthcare policy is or energy policy. You see where I'm going? Tax policy. So my question is, is it possible to quantify, if we had a permanent, predictable policy on healthcare, tax, energy, and so forth, if it was possible to predict and have a permanency in that, how does that affect unemployment? And is it possible to quantify that? And then maybe secondarily, how do private staffing companies deal with the uncertainty that's out there in terms of tax policy, energy policy, healthcare policy?
If you want to start with me on that,
Sure.
I always like to use scientific analogies. It is possible to measure it, but it's very difficult. Like in the lab, if you want to do an experiment, in the simplest possible experiment, you take one test tube and one bottle of liquid and another bottle of liquid and mix them. But only one test tube. What we're doing in Washington and everywhere else in the world, we've got 1,000 test tubes, 2,000 bottles of one reagent, in fact 3,000 reagents, and they're all being mixed together all at the same time, and we think we're finding out what works and what doesn't. It's impossible. Nevertheless, you can kind of hold everything constant, which is a very heroic assumption, and look at periods in history when we had more uncertainty, particularly regime uncertainty, which you're emphasizing, and periods in which we had less. A good example, which is very testable, would be monetary policy. Decades in which we had very variable monetary policy, very great volatility in interest rates, have been decades of low economic growth. And the same would apply to a large number of government policies. You can measure it to that extent, but at least you can test it to that degree.
During the lifetime that I was in the business, our business did nothing but grow because we were just a small part of putting people back to work. People got jobs on their own, companies advertised themselves, the state employment services put people back to work. I mean, everybody was in the business, but our portion of it kept growing. And we had recessions and depressions, from the 50s on. You all know that, those of you who've studied it in your classes, your economics classes. But today, right now today, the word that I get from my friends in the business is that they're having a hard job finding people to fill the jobs they have. So it means something's wrong. We're paying people not to work. They won't come back into the marketplace. So something is happening because companies, when economy starts to come back and they need people, they go to the temporary services because they don't want to put them on their payroll where they've got to do all kinds of benefits and whatnot. They hire them temporary first. And then if things continue to get better and better, then they take those people and put them on their payroll because they want to keep them once they got them trained. So, and we're feeling that right now. Companies are wanting to hire, and we can't find the people for them.
And let me tell you what I tell my corporate clients. I'm a little hesitant to tell you for free what I tell them for money, but I am telling them to expect greater volatility in the economy, more cycles. The booms will be boomier, the busts will be bustier. Bust, economic sense. And as a result, I'm suggesting that their capital spending be relatively smaller and more modular. Don't build that big, huge factory. Instead, build a small incremental addition to it. So there's the advice that's kind of working against economic development. I tell them try to use contract employees rather than full-time permanent staff. In a more cyclical economy, you don't want to have to lay off people. So the best advice to companies for a cyclical environment is actually advice that slows down the recovery from this current recession. And it's one of the sad things. Once we get, if you're driving a car, once you start to skid, it's hard to get back on track, and we are now swerving left, swerving right, and we need to get back into a more stable track to get the economy going.
I'd like to point out that one economic estimate found that if you just reduce the corporate tax rate to 25%, over 5 years you will inject $500 billion into the GDP, which obviously, and for goods made here, not $500 billion in some other country where they have a multinational. So obviously that will spur hiring and at least higher wages. Also, I'd like to point out too that the corporate tax rate tends to be, what people don't think about is that it's often regressive for workers. Because if you have, one example is, let's say that each state has its corporate tax rate. If you have a state in Washington that has 35% and a neighboring state has 25%, that company is going to move to the state with a lower rate. So you end up having an excess supply of workers in Washington. And then when they do find jobs, because of the excess supply, they're going to be paid lower wages. So typically, the corporate tax rate overall is regressive. So if we lowered it, not only will we have probably more hiring, but we'd have higher wages. And that's extremely important for for the shrinking workforce we have, and the fact that payroll taxes are going to need to cover Social Security and the disability I talked about.
Go ahead.
Me? Sure, yeah. Okay, well, first of all, I'm a business and a political science major, and that hour that you all just spoke was probably the best economics lesson I've had in 3 years, so thank you for that. And I had a question about, you said half of the people with disabilities under 50 are filing like depression and anxiety.
Half of them have what they call a mental disability,
Right.
which could be anything from schizophrenia, bipolar, anything that they acquire, any type of brain damage. Half of those people, though, have anxiety or depression.
So I guess my question is, what are like the qualifications for people? Like, what's the process people go through to like receive benefits like this?
Well, typically what they do is, you apply for benefits online. If you have a disability that's pretty obvious, like a physical one, and you have medical records to prove that, that's all you need to do to, you submit them to Social Security. In some cases, if your disability is not so clear, they will send you to a doctor of their choice and pay for your examination, and that doctor will determine whether or not you're disabled. And then once all that paperwork is filled out and they have records, it takes about 3 to 4 months. One of the problems is that they passed some laws back in the mid-'80s that allowed more relaxed criteria for disability. For example, one of the most common is now you can go in and say you have back pain. And even if an MRI does not show any back pain, they have to take that into consideration when approving your claim. Same with anything like depression. Depression, anxiety, they're very hard to quantify. I mean, you might actually have depression, whereas they might think you have a thyroid condition or vice versa. So what we have now is we have these very unquantifiable conditions that we've had since the mid-'80s. And if you'll notice, since about the early 90s, the rolls have just been soaring. And so many of these conditions are very unquantifiable. I mean, there are people who are truly disabled. I'm not discounting that at all. But in the Social Security Administration, they have the responsibility of putting you through another physical, like every 1, 3, or 7 years, depending on your condition. You know, they just kind of do a follow-up. They don't typically do that. They're so backlogged, they don't follow up. So we have people that have back pain, depression, and sadly, these are things that with advanced medical treatments that are very easily treatable, and they tend to get better over time. But we lose those people out of the workforce for good.
And Pam, you're talking about Social Security disability.
Yes.
Not necessarily the workers' comp program that every state runs for job-related disability. Is that right?
Right. And in fact, I might also add that there are, typically if you buy long-term disability through your employer, if you go on a private disability system, it's actually quite effective. Not only do they pay you your benefits, but they also will often offer some type of vocational training that you can receive while you're getting disability benefits so that you can transition to another job that's more suitable. Because it's really very rare that somebody is completely disabled where they can't answer a phone, they can't type on a computer, especially now. There's so many accommodations. There's, if you can't type very well, there's voice recognition software. So, but sadly, we have this population under 50 that is becoming more disabled. So.
I have a question about this idea of using the staffing companies, private companies, to help place the unemployed workers. That's your job already in the private sector. So were you saying that there should be government programs to encourage you to do more of that?
No, because they're being paid by the companies.
Right.
And so the companies in tight budgetary times are trying to find the people themselves through the internet and have their own employees refer people to them and so on. Under this program, the staffing services would be reimbursed by the government their charge for placing someone. Now, the company doesn't have to pay, which is wonderful. They love it. So they're using the staffing services to screen their people, to test them and give them drug tests and so on. And so the companies would be more amenable to using their services and, you know, without them having to pay. But the reduction in what is being paid out in unemployment compensation and welfare payments and so on would more than offset. I mean, it's 3-4 times the amount that they would pay for that service.
But if I'm a corporation and I'm already paying the staffing service to find somebody, if I really need to hire, why should the government be reimbursing me for that cost? That's a type of corporate welfare, isn't it?
No, what you're doing, we're doing everything to incentivize things to happen and spending all $750 billion to incentivize and make things happen. Let's incentivize companies to utilize the private services more than they are today, because they're restricting that. They're trying their best to save dollars. And it's, you know, it's pound wise and penny foolish, but you know, it would be better if the government paid the service to help that company find someone and then take those people off the rolls. It's you know, the savings are astronomical.
And let me say that we don't have the details of how this will work. We're beginning the discussion. And in my vision, we would be asking staffing companies to take a step beyond what they're currently doing and make a greater effort for those who are currently unemployed, because right now a staffing company is trying to place people, and helping somebody who's unemployed is something they do if it is on the path to placing somebody in a job where a company will pay for it. They are less interested in working with unemployed people if they don't see that fairly immediate path. So we're saying, let's, or at least I'm saying, let's say to the staffing company, look at this person who's kind of a challenge and put extra effort into placing this person, and we will provide you with some of the savings that accrue to the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund.
It sounds like the private staffing services would replace things like job centers and other sort of government-run facilities or programs that are being used to place people around.
Might replace job centers or might be an addition to job centers. I'm not quite sure how we'd want to do that. But we need to understand that most of the action for an unemployment insurance recipient right now is all electronic. And there are job centers, but they're fairly lightly used when you consider how many million unemployed people we have now. And this would be a way to step up the face-to-face interaction.
Job centers, the USES and the state employment services are not set up to place people. They have on the wall, they have jobs hanging on the wall. If you've ever been in one of their offices, they have computers you can go sit at, and if you know how to work them, you can go to the computer and try to look for a job in the computer. And that doesn't go too far with most of these unemployed people. They get discouraged very quickly, but they don't have people there. They don't have the numbers of people there to really sit down and work with someone and interview them and find out what their skills are, what abilities they have, and match them with jobs and arrange interviews for them, follow up, get them to follow up, all of the things that are necessary to make a placement. The state employment services do not do that. But they would be busy, because every time an employment service placed someone, the state employment service would have to verify that they were on unemployment compensation, and they would have to do all the necessary paperwork. So actually, their staffs might increase to handle the flow of these numbers of people going back to work. By the way, we want to put America to work, putting America to work. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Let's make this the last question. We're just running a little over time.
Sure. Okay. So with the staffing companies, you mentioned two problems: the two-bucket problem, which I agree with the solution, but the cream skimming problem, which you said refers to the risk that staffing companies might receive compensation for people who can quickly find jobs themselves. You offered the solution: the staffing company would be compensated less for easy-to-employ individuals and more for hard-to-place people. But it seems to me that if they're compensated higher for this lower quality work or harder-to-place work, it would create the incentive for them to just help those people over the easy-to-employ, which would then either raise the costs of the program in the first place or just kind of flood the market with like poor quality work and make it harder for the better qualified workers to work. Is there a way to prevent that?
Good question. We would need to get the compensation right. And, I was thinking about other areas where there's variable level of service. My father-in-law is in a nursing home. And you'd think at first, if you're running a facility for retired people, you wouldn't want folks who are half paralyzed. You'd want the healthy. Well, it turns out you can get paid more for dealing with the very ill people, but there's still a market for serving the fairly healthy people. So we have a wide range of services. And what we would hope for is that there'd be a wide range of employment services. There'd be somebody who maybe, for the computer scientist, just cuts his job search by just a week because he's so employable, but for somebody else cuts the job search by 12 weeks. And it'll be a statistical challenge at first, and then we'll learn from experience. But if we get it right, there'll be companies specializing in every kind of niche out there.
Great. Well, if you haven't figured it out by now, you have the materials in your packet. Contact us. There's a card in there. If you have any questions, check out ncpa.org, and let's hear it for this terrific panel.